Aisha wiped her hands on her white coat and glanced at the clock above the emergency room entrance. It was already past midnight, and the fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead. She had been working at City General Hospital for 3 years now, ever since she finished her medical training. The job was demanding. The hours were brutal. But she preferred it that way. When you're busy saving lives, you don't have time to think about your own problems. She walked toward the nurse's station to check on her next patient when she heard voices coming from the staff room. One voice was unfamiliar, deep and warm, with a slight accent that suggested he was from somewhere up north. Aisha didn't pay much attention. New doctors came and went all the time. She had learned not to get too friendly with anyone. Keep your head down, do your work, go home. That was her routine, and it had served her well for the past 2 years. The next morning during rounds, she finally saw him, Dr. Rahul Malhotra. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that was slightly messy despite his obvious attempt to comb it properly. He wore thin-framed glasses that kept sliding down his nose, and every few minutes he'd push them back up with his index finger. He was a pediatric surgeon, transferred from a big hospital in Mumbai. The head of their department introduced him to everyone, and when his eyes met Aisha's, he smiled. Not a polite smile, but a genuine one that reached his eyes. She looked away quickly and focused on her patient files. She didn't have time for this. She didn't have space in her life for new people, especially not charming doctors with nice smiles. Their first case together came sooner than she expected. A 7-year-old boy had come in with severe abdominal pain, and Aisha was handling the diagnosis. Rahul was called in for a consultation because they suspected it might need surgical intervention. She presented her findings clearly and professionally, keeping her tone neutral. The child had acute appendicitis, and they needed to operate within the next few hours. Rahul listened carefully, nodding at appropriate moments. When she finished, he said something that caught her off guard. He told her that her diagnostic approach was excellent, that she had caught details most residents would have missed. He said it with such sincerity that for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She simply nodded and turned her attention back to the patient. After the surgery, which went smoothly, Rahul found her in the corridor. He asked if she wanted to grab coffee from the hospital cafeteria. His tone was casual, friendly, like he was asking a colleague to discuss a case over a warm drink, but Aisha saw through it. She had been through this before. 2 years ago, someone had been friendly with her too. Someone had made her believe in things like partnership and future and forever. And then one day, that same someone had packed their bags and left her standing alone, holding an engagement ring that suddenly meant nothing. She told Rahul she was busy. Her voice came out colder than she intended, but she didn't soften it. She made it clear that she wasn't interested in workplace friendships or casual conversations over coffee. She had her patients, her work, and that was enough. He looked a bit surprised, maybe even hurt, but he recovered quickly and simply said, "Okay," before walking away. That should have been the end of it. She expected him to keep his distance after that. Most people did once they realized she wasn't interested in being social, but as the days went by, she kept running into him. Not in an obvious way, but in the small moments that fill up a hospital shift. He'd be at the nurse's station when she arrived to check on medications. He'd be in the doctor's lounge when she went to grab a quick bite between patients. He'd be leaving the hospital at the same time she was heading to her car in the parking lot. And every single time, he was kind. Not pushy. Not overly friendly. Just consistently kind in a way that felt genuine. He'd ask how her day was going. He'd hold the elevator door when he saw her rushing. Once, when she dropped her stethoscope, he picked it up and handed it to her with that same warm smile. What bothered her most was that she found herself thinking about him when she got home. She'd replay their brief conversations in her mind, analyzing why someone would be this persistent in being nice to a person who clearly wasn't welcoming it. She wondered about his story, about what brought him here from Mumbai, about whether he had people waiting for him back home. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized something that made her uncomfortable. She was curious about him. And curiosity was dangerous. Curiosity led to questions. Questions led to conversations. Conversations led to connection. And connection led to pain. She had learned that lesson the hard way, and she wasn't about to repeat the same mistake. The next morning, she made a decision. She would be even more distant, even more professional. She would make sure Dr. Rahul Malhotra understood that she wasn't interested in whatever he was offering, whether it was friendship or anything else. She had built walls around her heart for a reason, and she wasn't going to let anyone climb over them. Not again. Never again. 3 weeks had passed since Rahul joined the hospital, and Aisha found that avoiding him completely was harder than she thought. They worked in the same building, attended the same meetings, and sometimes handled cases that overlapped. But what made it really difficult was that he seemed to understand people in a way that was both annoying and fascinating. During one particularly exhausting shift, Aisha had been on her feet for almost 16 hours straight. She had handled 2 emergency cases, 1 difficult family meeting, and countless routine checkups. Her head was pounding, and she hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. She sat down at the nurse's station for just a moment, closing her eyes and rubbing her temples. When she opened her eyes, there was a paper cup of chai sitting in front of her. She looked around and saw Rahul a few feet away, talking to one of the nurses about a patient's medication schedule. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't waiting for a thank you. He had simply left the chai there and continued with his work. She stared at the cup for a long moment. It was still warm. She could smell the cardamom and ginger. Exactly the way she liked it. How did he even know she preferred chai over coffee? She picked up the cup and took a sip. It was perfect, and that made her even more frustrated. This became a pattern. She'd find herself overwhelmed during a shift, and somehow Rahul would appear with exactly what she needed. Sometimes it was chai, sometimes it was a chocolate bar from the vending machine. Once it was even a sandwich because he'd noticed she'd skipped lunch. He never made a big deal out of it, never waited for acknowledgement. He just did these small things and moved on. The thing that really got to her was how he treated everyone this way. She watched him with the other staff members, with patients' families, even with the cleaning crew that came through at night. He remembered names. He asked about people's lives. He celebrated when the receptionist's daughter got into college. He brought sweets when one of the nurses had a baby. This wasn't an act he was putting on just for her. This was genuinely who he was. One evening, the hospital was particularly quiet. Most of the day shift had gone home, and the night shift hadn't fully settled in yet. Aisha was finishing up some paperwork when the sky suddenly opened up. Rain came down in sheets, drumming against the windows with such force that she could barely see the parking lot outside. She groaned inwardly. She had taken an auto rickshaw to work that morning because her scooter was being repaired. Finding an auto in this weather would be nearly impossible, and she lived 40 minutes away. She resigned herself to waiting it out, no matter how long it took. That's when Rahul appeared beside her, looking out the same window. He asked if she needed a ride home. She almost said no automatically, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the sound of the rain. Or maybe it was the simple kindness in his voice that held no expectation. She found herself saying, yes. His car was parked close to the entrance, and they ran through the rain anyway, laughing despite themselves as they got drenched in those few seconds. Once inside the car, they both caught their breath. The rain pounded on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound around them. Rahul started the engine to get the heater going, but he didn't drive off immediately. The rain was too heavy to see through properly. They sat there in comfortable silence for a while. Then Rahul mentioned that his favorite thing about rain was how it made everything feel paused, like the whole world was taking a break. Aisha surprised herself by agreeing. She told him that as a child, she used to love dancing in the rain until her mother would call her inside. Worried she'd catch a cold. That opened a door she hadn't meant to open. They started talking. Really talking. In a way she hadn't talked to anyone in years. He asked about her family, and she told him about her parents who lived in Pune, about her younger brother who was studying engineering, about her grandmother who made the best biryani in the world. He told her about growing up in a small town near Delhi, about how his father was a teacher, and his mother had run a small tailoring shop from their home. Then he went quiet for a moment, and she could see something shift in his expression. He told her about his mother's illness, how it had started with small symptoms they all ignored, how by the time they caught it, the cancer had already spread. He talked about watching her fight, watching her suffer through treatments, watching her smile even when she was in pain because she didn't want her family to worry. He told her that his mother passed away when he was in his final year of medical school, that her death almost made him quit because he felt like he had failed at the one thing that should have mattered most. But then he realized that she would have wanted him to continue, to help other people, to save the children he could save. That's why he became a pediatric surgeon. Every child he helped was a promise kept to his mother. Aisha felt something crack inside her chest. She understood loss, but hearing him speak about it with such raw honesty made her realize that she had been so focused on her own pain that she had forgotten everyone carried their own burdens. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand on his arm, just for a moment. She told him that his mother would be proud of the doctor he had become. The rain started to ease up, and Rahul drove her home. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from heavy topics to lighter ones. They discovered they both loved old Hindi songs. Both thought hospital coffee was terrible but drank it anyway. Both had a habit of talking to themselves when working through difficult problems. When they reached her apartment building, she sat in the car for an extra moment. She wanted to invite him up for real chai, the kind she made at home that was even better than any cafe. She wanted to continue this conversation, to learn more about him, to share more about herself, but fear grabbed her by the throat. What if she let him in and he left like everyone else? What if she started to depend on these moments, and then they disappeared? She thanked him for the ride and got out of the car quickly. As she walked to her door, she could feel him watching, waiting to make sure she got inside safely. She turned to wave, and he waved back before driving away. That night, she lay in bed listening to the rain and thinking about everything they had talked about. She thought about how easy it had been, how natural it had felt. And that scared her more than anything else. The days following that rainy evening felt different to Aisha, and she didn't like it one bit. She found herself looking for Rahul during her shifts, and when she caught herself doing it, she felt angry at her own weakness. This was exactly what she had promised herself she wouldn't do. She couldn't let someone back into the carefully controlled space she had created around her life. So she started avoiding him deliberately. When she saw him in the corridor, she'd suddenly remember something urgent she needed to do in the opposite direction. She changed her lunch timings to make sure they wouldn't overlap in the cafeteria. She volunteered for night shifts even though she hated them, just because she knew he mostly worked during the day. If they had to interact during rounds or case discussions, she kept her responses short and professional, never letting the conversation drift into anything personal. Priya, her best friend and fellow doctor, noticed immediately. One afternoon, she cornered Aisha in the supply room and asked her directly what was going on. Priya had known her since medical school, had been there through the broken engagement, had held her while she cried, and helped her pick up the pieces. If anyone could see through her walls, it was Priya. Aisha tried to brush it off, saying she was just busy with work. But Priya wasn't having it. She pointed out that Aisha was running away from something, and knowing her, it was probably something good. She mentioned that she'd seen how Rahul looked disappointed these days, how he'd asked casually if Aisha was avoiding him, how he seemed genuinely confused about what he'd done wrong. That made Aisha defensive. She snapped that she didn't owe Rahul anything, that she had the right to choose who she spent time with, that Priya should mind her own business. But even as she said these things, she could hear how hollow they sounded. Priya just looked at her with sad eyes and said that she wasn't telling her what to do, but running away from happiness because she was scared of pain was no way to live. Then she left Aisha alone with those words echoing in her mind. Meanwhile, Rahul seemed to understand that something had changed. He stopped seeking her out. He stopped leaving chai at her desk. He was polite when they had to work together, but the warmth had dimmed from his eyes. And somehow, that hurt more than Aisha expected. She told herself it was for the best, that this was proof she had made the right decision. But at night, when she was alone, she couldn't quite convince herself. Then came the case that changed everything. A 5-year-old girl named Zara was rushed into the emergency room with severe respiratory distress. Her parents were panicking. The child was turning blue, and every second counted. Aisha was the first doctor on the scene, and she immediately started assessment and stabilization. But as she examined the child, she realized this was beyond her expertise. The little girl needed surgery, and she needed it now. She called for Rahul, and he came running within minutes. They worked together with the kind of coordination that only comes from true professionals who trust each other's skills. Aisha handled the preoperative preparation while Rahul scrubbed in. They didn't need to discuss every step because they both knew exactly what needed to be done. In the operating room, with the child's life hanging in the balance, all the awkwardness and tension between them disappeared. There was only the work, only the shared goal of saving this little girl. The surgery lasted 4 hours. It was complicated, delicate work that required absolute focus. When it was finally over, and they knew Zara would be okay, the relief was overwhelming. Aisha felt her legs shake slightly as the adrenaline wore off. They both stepped out of the operating room, exhausted but satisfied. In the scrub room, as they washed up, the silence felt heavy. Aisha could feel Rahul's presence beside her, could sense that he wanted to say something. She focused on scrubbing her hands, counting the seconds the way they'd been taught, trying to maintain the distance she'd worked so hard to create. But then he spoke. His voice was quiet but clear. He asked her what she was so afraid of. Not in an accusatory way, but with genuine confusion, and maybe a hint of hurt. He said that he thought they had connected that night in the rain, that he thought maybe they could be friends at least. But then she had shut him out completely. He wanted to know what he had done wrong. Aisha felt something snap inside her. All the fear, all the pain she'd been carrying for 2 years, came rushing up. She turned to face him, and the words came out harsh and defensive. She told him to stop trying to fix her, that she wasn't some broken thing that needed his kindness. She said she didn't need saving, didn't need his friendship, or his chai, or his concern. She just wanted to be left alone to do her job. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them, but pride and fear kept her from taking them back. Rahul stood there, water still dripping from his hands, and she saw something in his face that made her chest hurt. He looked sad, truly sad, but also resigned. He spoke slowly, measuring each word. He said that he had never thought she needed saving. He had never seen her as broken or incomplete. He had simply thought that two people who understood the weight of this job, who had both experienced loss and pain, who both cared about their patients with everything they had, might find some comfort in being friends. He had thought that maybe they could be happy together, could share the good days and help each other through the bad ones. But he understood now that she didn't want that. Then he did something that broke her completely. He apologized. He said he was sorry for pushing, sorry for making her uncomfortable, sorry for not respecting her boundaries. He told her that he would stay out of her way from now on, that she didn't have to avoid him anymore, because he would make sure their paths crossed as little as possible. He walked out of the scrub room, and Aisha stood there alone, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. She looked tired, not just from the long surgery, but from the exhausting work of keeping everyone at a distance. She saw the truth reflected back at her, the truth she had been running from. She wasn't protecting herself. She was punishing herself. She was so afraid of being hurt again that she was choosing to be alone, choosing to push away someone who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. She thought about her ex-fiancé, about how the pain of that loss had convinced her that she was better off alone. But standing there in the empty scrub room, she realized that she had given him so much power. She had let one person's choice to leave define how she lived the rest of her life. And that wasn't strength. That was just another kind of weakness. The next few days were torture. Aisha went through her shifts mechanically, seeing patients, writing prescriptions, doing rounds. But her mind was elsewhere. True to his word, Rahul kept his distance. They'd pass each other in hallways, and he'd give her a polite nod but nothing more. No more warm smiles, no more casual greetings, no more moments of shared understanding. She told herself this was what she wanted. But every time she saw him, She felt a weight in her chest that got heavier each day. She started noticing things she hadn't paid attention to before. The way the nurses lit up when he asked about their families. The way young patients smiled when he made silly faces to distract them from their fear. The way he stayed late to comfort a mother whose child was in intensive care. Priya didn't say anything, but Aisha could feel her friend's eyes on her, watching, waiting for her to break. And she knew she would break eventually. The question was when and how badly. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. Aisha was in the doctor's lounge, grabbing a quick dinner between shifts, when she overheard two nurses talking. They were discussing how Dr. Rahul had requested a transfer back to Mumbai. Apparently, he had family there who needed him, and he'd already spoken to the administration about it. He would be leaving in 2 weeks. Aisha felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She set down her food, suddenly unable to eat. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks before he disappeared from her life completely. And the worst part was that it was her fault. She had pushed him away so effectively that now he was actually leaving. She tried to focus on work, but her mind kept drifting. She imagined the hospital without him. She imagined never seeing his face again, never hearing his laugh, never having the chance to know him better. And suddenly, all her carefully constructed reasons for keeping him at a distance seemed stupid and meaningless. What was she really protecting herself from? Pain? She was already in pain, had been in pain for the past 2 years. The only difference was that she had chosen this pain, had wrapped herself in it like armor. But armor was heavy, and she was tired of carrying it. That night, after her shift ended, she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for a long time. Rain had started again. Gentler this time. A soft patter against the windshield. She thought about that evening weeks ago when they'd sat in his car, talking like old friends. She thought about how easy it had felt. How right. She made a decision. Maybe it was the wrong decision. Maybe she would regret it. Maybe he would hurt her eventually. But at least she would have tried. At least she wouldn't spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been. She drove to his apartment. She'd looked up his address from the hospital directory. Something she would never have admitted to anyone. Her heart pounded the entire way there. She practiced what she would say, but every version sounded wrong in her head. How do you apologize for weeks of coldness? How do you explain fear to someone who's been nothing but kind? When she reached his building, she almost turned back 3 times. But something kept pushing her forward. She climbed the stairs to his floor, found his door, and stood there for a full minute before finally raising her hand to knock. He opened the door looking surprised, and then cautious. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. His glasses perched on his head, his hair messy like he'd been running his hands through it. Behind him, she could see packing boxes stacked in the corner of his living room. The reality of his leaving hit her all over again. She opened her mouth to speak, to say the carefully planned words, to explain and apologize and ask for another chance. But nothing came out. Her throat felt tight. Her eyes burned with tears. She'd been holding back for too long. Instead, something else happened. She reached out her hand, intending to push him away one more time, to protect herself from this vulnerability, to rebuild her walls before they crumbled completely. But her hand started shaking, violently, uncontrollably shaking. She stared at her own trembling hands in shock. Her body was betraying her, refusing to follow the commands her frightened mind was giving. She couldn't push him away. She physically couldn't do it. And in that moment, she understood that her heart had made a choice her mind wasn't ready to accept. Tears started falling, hot and fast down her cheeks. All the pain from her broken engagement, all the loneliness of the past 2 years, all the fear she'd been carrying, came pouring out. She tried to speak, to explain, but all that came out was a broken whisper. She told him she was scared. That was all she could say. Just those 3 words, over and over. She was scared. Rahul didn't say anything at first. He just gently took her, shaking hands in his, holding them steady, grounding her. His touch was warm and careful, like he was handling something precious and fragile. He guided her inside his apartment and closed the door behind them, shutting out the world. He led her to his couch and sat beside her, still holding her hands until they stopped trembling. He didn't rush her, didn't demand explanations, didn't make her feel foolish for showing up at his door in tears. He just waited, patient and present, while she cried out years of accumulated pain. When she finally caught her breath, when the tears slowed enough for her to speak, she told him everything. She told him about her engagement, about how excited she had been to build a life with someone. She talked about the plans they'd made, the future they'd imagined together. And then she told him about the day it all fell apart. Her fiancé had met someone else at work, someone younger, prettier, more fun. He'd told her that she was too serious, too focused on her career, too boring for him. He'd made her feel like she wasn't enough, like she had failed at being the kind of woman someone could love. And when he left, she'd promised herself she would never let anyone make her feel that way again. She explained how she'd built walls around herself, how she'd convinced herself that being alone was safer than risking that kind of pain again. She admitted that when Rahul had shown up at the hospital, when he'd been so consistently kind and genuine, it had terrified her. Because part of her wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that not everyone would leave, but she didn't know how to take that risk. Rahul listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was soft but firm. He told her that being scared didn't mean she was weak. Being scared meant she was brave enough to try again, to open herself up to the possibility of connection despite the risk of pain. He admitted that he'd been scared too. After his mother's death, he'd thrown himself into work, using it to avoid dealing with his grief. He'd kept people at arm's length, never staying in one place long enough to form deep connections. The transfer to this city had been another escape, another way to avoid putting down roots. But then he'd met her. He'd seen how dedicated she was to her patients, how competent and caring she was, and he'd been drawn to that. And when they'd talked that rainy night, when she'd opened up even just a little, he'd realized that maybe running wasn't the answer. Maybe finding someone who understood the weight of their work, who shared their passion and their struggles, was worth the risk of staying. He told her that he'd requested the transfer back to Mumbai because he thought that was what she wanted. He thought he was making things easier for her by removing himself from her life. But the truth was, he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay. He wanted to know her better, to share meals with her, to have long conversations about everything and nothing, to be there for her during difficult days and celebrate with her during good ones. Aisha felt something shift inside her chest, like a locked door finally opening. She realized that she had been so focused on protecting herself from pain that she'd been closing herself off from joy too. She'd been so afraid of endings that she'd forgotten how to have beginnings. She asked him if he really meant what he said, if he genuinely wanted to try despite her mess of fears and insecurities. He smiled then, that same warm smile that had caught her attention that first day. And he told her that everyone had fears and insecurities. The question wasn't whether they had them, but whether they were willing to work through them together. He said he wasn't asking for perfection. He wasn't asking her to have everything figured out or to never be scared again. He was just asking for honesty. If she was worried about something, she could tell him. If she needed space, she could ask for it. If she was having a bad day, she could share that. They could take things slowly, at whatever pace felt right for both of them. That night, Rahul canceled his transfer request. They talked until dawn, sharing stories and dreams and fears. He told her about his childhood, about the small town where he grew up, about his father, who still taught English to high school students. She told him about her family, about her grandmother's biryani recipe that she'd never quite mastered, about her brother's terrible jokes that somehow always made her laugh. The next few weeks were different. They started meeting for coffee before shifts, actually sitting together this time. They'd talk about their cases, about challenging diagnoses, about the small victories that made their difficult job worthwhile. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, both reading medical journals or catching up on paperwork. Rahul introduced her to his favorite street food place, a small stall that served the most amazing pani puri she'd ever tasted. She took him to her grandmother's house in Pune one weekend, where he charmed her entire family and earned her grandmother's approval by asking for her biryani recipe. They took walks in the park near the hospital during lunch breaks when the weather was nice. They discovered they both loved old Hindi film songs, and they'd sometimes send each other links to their favorites. He learned that she liked her chai with extra ginger, and she learned that he had a weakness for chocolate ice cream even though it always gave him a mild headache. There were difficult moments too. Times when Aisha's fears would resurface, when she'd catch herself pulling back instinctively. But true to his word, Rahul was patient. He'd notice when she was withdrawing, and he'd gently ask what was wrong, and slowly, she learned to voice her fears instead of running from them. She learned that talking about being scared made the fear less powerful. 3 months after that rainy night when she'd shown up at his door, they were sitting in that same parking lot where they'd first really talked. Rahul had brought her something, and he seemed almost nervous as he handed it to her. It was a small potted plant, a jade plant with thick green leaves. He explained that his mother used to keep jade plants all over their house. She'd always said that relationships were like these plants. They needed patience and care. You couldn't force them to grow faster than they were ready to, but if you gave them consistent attention and the right conditions, they'd flourish. You had to water them regularly but not too much. You had to give them light but also let them rest. And most importantly, you had to believe they would grow even when you couldn't see progress happening. Aisha took the plant, holding it carefully. She looked at Rahul, at this kind, patient man who had somehow found his way past all her defenses. She thought about how far she'd come. From that cold, closed-off person who had refused his first offer of coffee, to someone who could sit here now, holding a plant that symbolized growth and possibility. She smiled and told him that she'd never been good with plants, that she'd probably forget to water it sometimes or give it too much sun. But she wanted to try. She wanted to learn how to take care of something that needed patience and consistent effort. Because that's what they were doing, wasn't it? Learning how to grow together. Rahul laughed and said that was exactly right. He promised he'd remind her to water it when she forgot. He'd be there to help her figure out the right balance. They'd learn together. As they sat there in the car, with the little jade plant between them, Aisha realized something important. She'd spent 2 years believing that her broken engagement had ruined her, that it had made her incapable of trust and love. But that wasn't true. It had just taught her to be more careful, more intentional about who she let into her life, and maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. The past would always be part of her story. But it didn't have to define her future. She could choose to try again, to believe in second chances, to trust that not everyone would leave. It was still scary sometimes, but having Rahul beside her made it feel possible. She reached out and took his hand, and this time, her hands didn't shake at all. They were steady and sure, ready to hold on to something good, ready to grow together one patient day at a time.